science section of the New York Times. A lot of publicity on this gentleman whose name is Uri, U-R-I, Uri Geller.
For 30 years, Johnny Carson set the standard for late-night television. Most guests knew exactly how to behave, but some crossed the line. These are 7 times Johnny Carson shut down disrespectful guests. Number 1. Uri Geller's failed performance. Uri Geller had built an international career claiming he could bend spoons with his mind. Throughout the early 1970s, he'd appeared on television shows around the world, convincing audiences that he possessed genuine psychic powers. People wanted to believe in something beyond the ordinary, something that defied the laws of physics and suggested humans had untapped potential. Geller gave them exactly what they wanted to see: spoons twisting, keys bending, all supposedly through the power of his mind alone. When he was booked on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson saw an opportunity. Carson was an amateur magician himself, someone who'd learned sleight of hand as a teenager growing up in Nebraska. He'd spent years practicing tricks, understanding how illusions worked, appreciating the craft of magic when it was presented honestly as entertainment. He knew how these supposed psychic demonstrations were performed, and he suspected Geller was nothing more than a skilled magician pretending his tricks were supernatural powers. That bothered Carson on a fundamental level. Magic was an art form that required practice and skill. Claiming that your carefully rehearsed tricks were actually psychic abilities wasn't just dishonest, it was insulting to real magicians and to audiences. So Johnny decided he would expose Geller on national television. This wouldn't be a friendly interview where Geller got to perform his usual act unchallenged. Before the show, Carson gave very specific instructions to his staff. Nobody was allowed to let Geller or anyone associated with him touch any of the props beforehand, not even for a moment, not for any reason. The spoons, keys, and metal objects that Geller would supposedly bend with his mind had to remain completely secure, locked away until the cameras started rolling. Carson knew that Geller's tricks required preparation, manipulating the items in advance, weakening them, or setting them up in ways that would make them appear to bend spontaneously later. When the show started and Geller came out to perform, his act fell apart spectacularly. Over 5 segments spanning an agonizing 28 minutes of television, he struggled and failed repeatedly. He picked up the spoons, touched them, concentrated intensely, tried everything he could think of. Nothing worked. The objects wouldn't bend. The keys stayed straight. His supposed psychic powers failed to materialize. The studio audience sat in awkward silence, watching a man's reputation crumble in real time. Johnny didn't gloat or mock him. He just let the failure speak for itself, maintaining his composure while Geller sweated through segment after segment. Finally, after nearly half an hour of excruciating television, Geller managed only to slightly bend a single spoon. It was unclear whether he'd actually bent it or if it had already been slightly bent to begin with. The performance was a complete disaster, and everyone watching knew it. Years later, Geller admitted he hadn't known Carson was an amateur magician or a total skeptic. He'd walked into a trap, and by the time he realized what was happening, it was too late to recover. But here's the fascinating part. The exposure actually helped Geller's career in an unexpected way. His true believers interpreted the failure as proof that his powers were genuine. If he'd been doing magic tricks, they reasoned, surely he could have performed them any time. The fact that he couldn't do it under Carson's controlled conditions only proved to them that his abilities were real but unpredictable. Geller turned the disaster into a story about how skeptical energy disrupts psychic phenomena. Johnny had deliberately set him up to fail, and it worked perfectly. Geller was humiliated on national television in front of millions of viewers, and he never received another invitation to The Tonight Show. Carson had used his platform to expose what he believed was deception, and he did it without saying a single mocking word. Sometimes the best way to shut someone down is to simply let them fail on their own, to remove the conditions that allow the trick to work, and then watch what happens. Number 2. Charles Grodin's confrontational interviews. Charles Grodin became famous for his appearances on The Tonight Show, but not in the traditional way. While most guests came on to promote their latest project with cheerful anecdotes and grateful smiles, Grodin took a different approach. He confronted Johnny directly, questioning whether Carson actually cared about his guests or what they had to say. It was performance art disguised as an interview, and it drove Johnny crazy. In one memorable 1990 appearance, Grodin was promoting both his film, Taking Care of Business, and the paperback release of his memoir. The interview immediately turned contentious. Grodin brought up how Johnny had criticized advertised the hardcover price of his book on a previous appearance, saying $18.95 was too much for a book. Johnny had suggested it might be worth that price if it were Mother Teresa's life story, but not Grodin's. Grodin remembered everything, stored it away, brought it back up. Then Grodin went for the throat. "I'm so sensitive, I really can't answer a question from someone who's not interested in the question," he said. Johnny insisted he was very interested. Grodin pushed harder. "But look at you. I mean, you don't really care what I have to say, do you, honestly?" Johnny's response was perfectly deadpan. "No, no." When Grodin looked shocked, Johnny continued, "I gotta do an hour a night. I'm looking for warm bodies, that's all. If I can get 7 minutes out of you, I take a bundle, I go home to Malibu." The exchange escalated. Grodin asked Johnny what he cared about in life, trying to cut through what he called the list of standard talk show topics. Johnny shot back that he had a terrible pain right now, aggravated by Grodin asking him dumb questions. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or cringe. Was this real anger or elaborate performance? NBC received angry letters from viewers who didn't understand that it was all an act, that Johnny and Grodin were actually friends playing out a scripted confrontation. Johnny shut Grodin down by refusing to play the game the way Grodin wanted. He matched Grodin's confrontational energy, admitted he didn't care, and made the whole thing into comedy. At one point, Grodin walked off the set during another appearance, saying, "The unfunny environment that preceded me out here makes it impossible to get laughs." Producer Freddie de Cordova reportedly said, "We won't be seeing Mr. Grodin for a while." And they didn't. At least not with Johnny hosting. Grodin could only return when guest hosts were running the show. Number 3. George Peppard's drunken heckling. May 2nd, 1975. Actor George Peppard arrived at The Tonight Show in less than ideal condition. Peppard was a major star at the time. He'd been in Breakfast at Tiffany's with Audrey Hepburn, starred in countless films and television shows, and was the kind of name that would draw viewers. But he'd been drinking before the show, and by the time he sat down with Johnny in the guest chair, he was visibly intoxicated. His words were slightly slurred, his movements unsteady, his judgment completely compromised. The other guest that night was Paul Williams, the diminutive singer-songwriter who'd written some of the biggest hits of the early 1970s. Williams had penned "We've Only Just Begun" for the Carpenters, "Rainy Days and Mondays," "You and Me Against the World," and "An Old-Fashioned Love Song." He was 5'2", soft-spoken, gentle in his demeanor. What should have been a standard interview about his music and upcoming projects turned into chaos because of Peppard's condition. Peppard started heckling Williams almost immediately. He made jokes about Williams' height, his appearance, his voice. He interrupted conversations, talked over both Johnny and Williams, derailed every attempt to have a normal discussion. The audience grew increasingly uncomfortable. They'd come to see Johnny Carson, to laugh, to enjoy celebrity interviews. Instead, they were watching a drunk actor bully a musician who was just trying to promote his work. Johnny tried repeatedly to steer the conversation back to normal territory. He'd redirect to Williams, ask a question, try to get things back on track, but Peppard wouldn't let it go. He kept interjecting, kept making comments, kept drawing attention back to himself and his increasingly inappropriate behavior. The heckling intensified with each passing minute. Williams, to his credit, tried to handle it with grace and professionalism, but Peppard was relentless. This wasn't playful banter or the kind of friendly teasing that could enhance an interview. This was mean-spirited and cruel. Finally, Johnny had enough. In a move that shocked everyone in the studio and watching at home, he stood up from behind his desk and walked off the set. Just left. The king of late night, the man who'd hosted thousands of shows without losing his composure, abandoned his own program rather than continue dealing with Peppard's behavior. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the stunned silence that followed Johnny's exit. Then Richard Harris, who was also a guest that night and had been watching the disaster unfold, seized the opportunity. Harris, himself known for drinking and wild behavior, slid behind Johnny's desk and took over hosting duties. He tried to salvage what was left of the show while Johnny cooled off somewhere backstage, probably fuming about what had just happened on his watch. It was one of the wildest nights in Tonight Show history, talked about for years afterward by anyone who saw it. The incident sent a clear message. Johnny Carson would not tolerate guests who disrespected other guests, no matter how famous they were or how much star power they brought to the show. Peppard had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He'd created an environment that was hostile and uncomfortable, and Johnny's response was to literally walk away from it. When Johnny did eventually return to the show and resumed his hosting duties, he made it clear through his silence on the matter that what had happened was completely unacceptable. He didn't lecture, didn't explain, didn't make a big speech about professional behavior. The act of walking off said everything that needed to be said. George Peppard had been shut down in the most dramatic way possible by making Johnny Carson abandon his own show. Number 4. Wayne Newton's office confrontation. Wayne Newton and Johnny Carson had been friendly for years. Newton had appeared on The Tonight Show around 30 times, but in 1980, both men wanted to buy the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. Carson and his partner signed a letter of intent to purchase the property for $103 million. The deal fell through. Newton swooped in with a backup offer of $85 million and eventually got the property. Carson felt betrayed and humiliated. He started making jokes about Newton on The Tonight Show, jokes that questioned Newton's masculinity, jokes that had a mean edge to them. Other comedians joined in, following Johnny's lead. For someone like Newton, whose voice and appearance had already made him a target for jokes throughout his career, this was devastating. The mockery was coming from the most powerful man in late-night television. Newton tried to reach Carson through proper channels. He called, sent messages, tried every professional avenue he could think of. Nothing worked. The jokes kept coming night after night. Finally, Newton decided he'd had enough of the professional approach. He drove to NBC's Burbank studios, walked down the halls, and barged directly into Johnny's office. Producer Fred DeCordova was sitting with Carson when Newton walked in. Newton told DeCordova to leave. The producer was so shocked that he actually got up and left the room. Then Newton laid it out plain for Johnny. "I don't know what friend of yours I've killed. I don't know what child of yours I've hurt. I don't know what food I've taken out of your mouth. But these jokes about me will stop, and they'll stop now, or I will kick your ass." Carson tried to defuse the situation, claiming to be Newton's biggest fan. Newton wasn't buying it. He told Johnny to drop the act and said he was there to straighten out whatever the problem was, whichever way Johnny wanted to handle it. The implication was clear. Newton was ready to settle this physically if necessary. This time, Johnny was the one who got shut down. The jokes stopped after that confrontation. Newton had called Carson's bluff and made it clear there would be consequences for continuing the harassment. Years later, Newton would say on Larry King Live that Johnny Carson was a mean-spirited human being who had hurt people in ways the public would never know about. The Aladdin feud showed a side of Carson that fans rarely saw: petty, vindictive, willing to use his platform to attack someone he felt had wronged him, and it showed that even the king of late night could be confronted and forced to back down. Number 5. Joan Rivers' unforgivable betrayal. Joan Rivers owed everything to Johnny Carson. He'd given her countless appearances on The Tonight Show starting in the 1960s. In 1983, he made her his permanent guest host, an honor that put her in the company of only a few select performers. She was part of the Tonight Show family, someone Johnny had personally championed and elevated to stardom. Their professional relationship was also a genuine friendship. They trusted each other. Then, in 1986, Rivers got her own show on the new Fox network. It would air in direct competition with The Tonight Show, going head-to-head with Johnny in the same late-night time slot. This wasn't just another comedian getting their own show. This was Johnny's protege becoming his direct competitor. The situation was delicate, and how Rivers handled it would determine whether their friendship survived. She didn't tell him. Johnny Carson found out about Joan Rivers' new show the same way everyone else did, through industry gossip and news reports. There was no phone call, no personal conversation, no acknowledgement of what Johnny had done for her career. For someone who'd been that close to him, who'd benefited so directly from his mentorship and support, it was an unforgivable breach of trust and loyalty. Johnny felt betrayed at the deepest level. This wasn't about competition. He could handle competition. David Letterman was on opposite him. Other shows came and went. It was about respect and basic human decency. Rivers had violated both by not having the courtesy to tell him personally before he heard it from someone else. The shutdown was absolute and permanent. Rivers and Carson never spoke again. For the remaining 6 years of his Tonight Show tenure, Rivers was persona non grata. She'd gone from permanent guest host to permanently banned. It wasn't about jokes or bad performances or even professional disagreements. It was about betrayal, plain and simple. Rivers later expressed regret about how she'd handled the situation, but by then, it was too late. Johnny Carson didn't forgive that kind of betrayal. When trust was broken that completely, there was no path back. He shut her down by cutting her out of his life entirely, and that silence spoke louder than any angry confrontation could have. Number 6. Carl Sagan's educational corrections. Carl Sagan was a recurring guest on The Tonight Show, and Johnny had tremendous respect for him. The astronomer had become a celebrity himself, thanks largely to his appearances on the show. Sagan had a gift for explaining complex scientific concepts in ways ordinary people could understand. When he talked about the cosmos, about billions and billions of stars, about humanity's place in the universe, viewers at home found themselves caring about astronomy. In 1986, Halley's Comet was making its once-in-a-lifetime passage by Earth. The whole country was watching for it, talking about it, excited by it. Sagan came on The Tonight Show to discuss the comet, and the audience was eager to learn. Everything was going fine until Sagan started correcting Johnny, not just once, but twice. On air, in front of millions of viewers. These weren't gentle corrections or subtle clarifications. They were direct challenges to statements Johnny had just made about the comet. Sagan wasn't being malicious. He was simply being a scientist. If something wasn't scientifically accurate, Carl Sagan wasn't going to let it slide, even on national television. To him, accuracy mattered more than politeness or protecting someone's ego. But intent doesn't change impact. Johnny hid his embarrassment behind his signature affable smile, that Midwestern charm that had made him America's favorite host. But underneath, he felt the sting of being made to look foolish. He'd been corrected like a student who'd gotten the answer wrong on his own show by his own guest. Despite his deep respect for Sagan as a scientist and as a person, Johnny made a decision. Carl Sagan was not invited back to The Tonight Show. The door that had helped make Sagan famous outside academic circles closed permanently. It was a harsh lesson in Tonight Show etiquette. You could be brilliant, you could be right about the science, you could even be Johnny's friend, but you didn't embarrass the host on his own show. That was the one rule nobody got to break, no matter how correct they were or how pure their intentions. Johnny shut Sagan down quietly, without drama or public explanation. Sagan simply stopped appearing, and that was that. Number 7. Ellen DeGeneres' forbidden material. Ellen DeGeneres was still early in her career when she appeared on The Tonight Show in the mid-1980s. Getting booked on Carson's show was a huge opportunity for any comedian, especially a young one still building a reputation. Before her set, Johnny had given her clear instructions about certain material she shouldn't perform. The specific content of what he'd warned her about isn't entirely clear from the historical record, but whatever it was, Johnny had been explicit. Don't do that material. Ellen went on stage and did it anyway. She performed exactly what Johnny had told her not to perform. Maybe she thought it would work, that the audience reaction would prove Johnny wrong. Maybe she thought she knew better than the king of late night what would play to his audience. Maybe she just decided to take a risk. Whatever her reasoning, she made a choice to ignore a direct instruction from the host of the show. After the show ended, Johnny confronted her, not in private, but right there in front of his staff. He pointed directly at her and said, "I told you not to do that material." Ellen looked embarrassed, and she should have been. This wasn't a disagreement about comedy sensibilities or creative differences. It was about following basic instructions and respecting the host's authority on his own show. Jim, one of the producers, made the consequences clear. "You won't be back again too soon," he told her, making Ellen and her guest leave. It was a humiliating end to what should have been a career-building appearance. Johnny had shut her down completely, making it clear that ignoring his instructions came with real consequences. Ellen did eventually return to The Tonight Show, but only in 1989 when Jay Leno was guest hosting. With Johnny behind the desk, she was banned. Her career obviously recovered and flourished. She went on to become one of the most successful comedians and talk show hosts of her generation. But in that moment, she learned that Johnny Carson's show operated by Johnny Carson's rules, and those rules weren't suggestions. The shutdown was about authority and respect. Johnny had created something extraordinary with The Tonight Show, and maintaining that required everyone to follow the same standards. When Ellen ignored his instructions, she showed disrespect, not just to Johnny personally, but to the entire system that made the show work. He responded by showing her the door. The Carson Standard. These 7 moments show different facets of how Johnny Carson handled disrespect. With Uri Geller, he used preparation and silence to expose a fraud. With Charles Grodin, he matched confrontational energy with brutal honesty. With George Peppard, he walked off his own show rather than continue. With Wayne Newton, he backed down when physically confronted about his own bullying. With Joan Rivers, he cut off all contact permanently. With Carl Sagan, he quietly closed the door. With Ellen DeGeneres, he delivered a public reprimand. What they all had in common was this: Johnny Carson had standards for his show, and he enforced them consistently. It didn't matter if you were a friend, a regular, or a first-time guest. It didn't matter if you were right or wrong, famous or unknown. If you disrespected the show, disrespected other guests, or disrespected Johnny himself, there were consequences. The consistency of Carson's standards created an environment where everyone knew the rules. Comedians prepared their absolute best 7 minutes because they knew Johnny wouldn't tolerate weak material. Guests arrived sober and professional because they'd heard what happened to George Peppard. Nobody ignored Johnny's instructions because Ellen DeGeneres had learned that lesson publicly. The standards weren't written down in some handbook. They were understood through observation and through the consequences that befell those who violated them. Some of these shutdowns seem justified even decades later. Exposing Uri Geller's fraud served the public interest. Walking off when George Peppard was drunk and abusive protected Paul Williams and maintained basic decency. Banning Charles Grodin after he walked off stage saying the environment was too unfunny to get laughs seemed fair. If you're going to insult the show, don't expect to be welcomed back. Other shutdowns seem petty or vindictive. Starting a feud with Wayne Newton over a business deal had nothing to do with The Tonight Show itself. Banning Carl Sagan for being too accurate with science facts seems small and ego-driven. Cutting off Joan Rivers forever because she didn't personally inform him about her Fox show, while understandable emotionally, seems harsh given their years of friendship. But taken together, they paint a picture of a man who had absolute control over his domain and used that power to shape every aspect of his show. For 30 years, The Tonight Show was Johnny Carson's kingdom, and he was the king. Guests understood this going in, or they learned it the hard way. The show operated by a code that everyone was expected to follow, and breaking that code had real consequences. In many ways, that control was what made The Tonight Show great. Johnny's standards created an environment where excellence thrived. Comedians knew they had to bring their absolute best material. Guests knew they had to be professional and respectful. The audience knew they were watching something where quality mattered and sloppiness wouldn't be tolerated. But that same control could also be harsh, unforgiving, and occasionally unfair. The same iron fist that maintained quality could also crush people who made honest mistakes or simply had different sensibilities. Johnny Carson was human, which meant he was capable of both generosity and pettiness, warmth and coldness, fairness and vindictiveness. He could launch a comedian's career with a simple hand gesture inviting them to the couch after their set, and he could end relationships with friends over perceived slights. He could expose fraud for the public good, and he could use his platform to make jokes at someone's expense over a business dispute. These 7 moments show that Johnny Carson wasn't just a gifted entertainer, he was also a man who knew exactly how much power he had and wasn't afraid to use it. Whether that power was used justly or unjustly depended on the situation, on Johnny's mood, on how he felt he'd been treated. But one thing was always certain: if you disrespected Johnny Carson or his show, you would face consequences. He would shut you down, one way or another, and in doing so, he maintained the standards that made The Tonight Show the gold standard of late-night television for 3 decades. Johnny Carson's legacy is complicated. He was the king of late night who set standards that elevated television comedy. He was also human, capable of holding grudges and using his power in ways that seem questionable in retrospect. But there's no denying that his willingness to shut down disrespectful guests, to enforce standards, to demand excellence, helped create something special that lasted 3 decades. If you enjoyed this look back at Johnny Carson's no-nonsense approach, hit that like button and subscribe for more classic television history. What other Carson moments should we cover? Let us know in the comments below.